The COINTELPRO Papers, Chapter 2. Please support this channel by clicking on the links below. Chapter 2. COINTELPRO CP USA. During the 10 years that I was on the U.S. Intelligence Board, never once did I hear anybody, including myself, raise the questions: is this course of action which we have agreed upon lawful? Is it legal? Is it moral and ethical? We never gave any thought to this realm of reasoning because we were just naturally pragmatists. The one thing we were concerned with was this: will this course of action work? Will it get us what we want? Will it reach the objective we desire to reach? William C. Sullivan, former FBI Assistant Director, 1975. The FBI's first formally designated COINTELPRO was directed against the Communist Party USA, CP or CP USA. It was initiated by a closely guarded memorandum written by Director J. Edgar Hoover to a select group of officials within the Bureau's counterintelligence and internal security wings on August 28, 1956, bidding them to create extra-legal action programs aimed at negating the CP's influence over the masses, ability to create controversy leading to confusion and disunity, penetration of specific channels in American life where public opinion is molded, and espionage and sabotage potential. With the exception of the last two areas mentioned, both of which seem to have been added on almost pro forma basis, the stated objectives of COINTELPRO CP USA were all entirely legal modes of activity. The objective was thus plainly to cripple or destroy the CP as a political rather than criminal entity. The immediate response to Hoover's concealed directive was a second secret memo, this one from Alan Belmont, head of the FBI's Internal Security Section, to L.V. Boardman of the Counterintelligence Division, recommending that these two legally separate units quietly collaborate to foster factionalism within the party and initiate on a broader scale than heretofore attempted a counterintelligence program against the CP. Belmont concluded that the Internal Security Section is giving this matter continuous thought, and we are remaining alert for situations which could afford additional opportunities for further disruption of the CP USA. FBI counterintelligence operations against the CP predate these memos. The party had been targeted for quote-unquote special attention from the moment it emerged under the leadership of Louis Freina and Charles E. Ruthenberg as a left-wing splinter of the Socialist Party of America, SPA, during September 1919. This was a period in American history when ideologies for positive social change had made tremendous inroads into the country's popular consciousness. Talk of a major reconstruction of American society was commonplace, and support for major and fundamental reforms was widespread. In a number of American cities, such as Butte, Montana, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Toledo, and Denver, soldiers, sailors, and workers' councils were formed in conscious imitation of the Russian Soviets, while thousands attended meetings in cities such as Denver, San Francisco, Seattle, and Washington, D.C., to demand recognition of Bolshevik Russia, the freeing of political prisoners, and withdrawal of American troops from Russia. Even more ominous in the eyes of conservatives was the clearly increasing strength of radicalism within the labor movement. In response to this massive upsurge of public sentiment to alter the U.S. socio-economic and political status quo, on June 12, 1919, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer requested that Congress appropriate $500,000 to quote-unquote fight radicalism. On July 19th, Congress appropriated special funds for the Justice Department for prosecuting radicals. And on August 1st, Palmer announced creation of the General Intelligence Division, GID, which had the sole function of collecting information on radical activities. Under the leadership of a 24-year-old graduate of Georgetown University Law School named J. Edgar Hoover, the GID began a program of collecting information on radicals from private, local, state, and military authorities, set up index files on hundreds of thousands of alleged radicals, began to heavily infiltrate radical organizations, and became a major agent fostering a Red Scare through its practice of sending out sensationalized charges against radicals to major organs of the media, including charges that strikes and race riots had connections to communist activity. The GID's program of general surveillance of radical activity was entirely without congressional authorization, since money appropriated could only be used for quote-unquote detection and prosecution of crimes. But the Justice Department got around this by authorizing the GID to secure evidence which might be of use under legislation, quote-unquote, which may hereafter be enacted. There is some evidence that Hoover deliberately exploited the radical issue to enhance the power and prestige of the GID, a tactic he would frequently use throughout his career. Actually, Hoover's prototype of the FBI did far more than surveil domestic dissidents. Indeed, it took a lead role in carrying out the so-called Palmer Raids, a draconian sweep of the nation designed to crush all manner of progressive expression in the U.S., from anarchism and radical unionism to socialism and communism. The first of these occurred on November 7, 1919, with GID agents raiding the offices of the Union of Russian Workers, URW, in 12 cities across the country. Although no evidence of criminal activity was ever linked to the URW, more than 650 warrantless arrests were effected. 250 more occurred in Detroit alone on November 8th. By December 21st, 242 alleged radical aliens who had received no token of due process in the matter were packed aboard the steamship Beaufort and arbitrarily deported to the USSR. As concerns the CP, the climactic event of the Red Scare occurred on January 2, 1920, when federal agents under the direction of Hoover and Palmer swooped down on radical hangouts in over 30 cities across the country and arrested somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 persons believed to be alien members of the CP and the closely related Communist Labor Party, CLP. Those arrested included virtually every local or national leader of the parties, and the raids disrupted the activities of practically every local communist organization in the country. The majority of arrests and break-ins were made without either search or arrest warrants. In New Jersey, several bombs were seized which turned out to be iron bowling balls. Throughout the country, only 3 pistols were seized in raids on what was claimed to be dangerous radicals actively plotting a revolution. Nonetheless, the January 2nd raids were followed up with quote-unquote minor sweeping operations in various parts of the country during the next 6 weeks, with the last major raid in Seattle on January 20th. The massive arrest completely overwhelmed detention facilities in many areas. In Detroit, 800 persons were detained for up to 6 days in a dark, windowless, narrow corridor in the city's federal building. They had access to one toilet and were denied food for 24 hours. Many of those arrested were beaten or threatened while in detention. In some cases, persons coming to visit or bail out those arrested were themselves arrested on suspicion of being communist. Palmer explained such persons were, quote, practically the same as a person found in an active meeting of the CP organization. Secretary of Labor William B. Wilson, meanwhile, announced on January 19th that mere membership in the CP would be considered sufficient grounds to warrant deportation of alien residents of the U.S. or bring about the denaturalization of those who had become citizens. An unknown number of party members were shipped abroad before U.S. District Judge George Anderson finally put a stop to the practice in June of 1920, sharply rebuking Palmer and Hoover as having fomented virtual mob rule from the right. A mob is a mob, whether made up of government officials acting under instructions from the Department of Justice or of criminals, loafers, and the vicious classes. Although the judge's ruling effectively ended the federal onslaught against progressive organizations, by the mid-20s, most liberals and social reformers had been thoroughly intimidated. But the more lasting significance of the Red Scare was its devastation of all the organizations that had been built up so laboriously for 20 years, which were capable of providing leadership for any sort of radical political or labor movement. The SPA, the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, and Anarcho-Syndicalist Union, the NPL, Nonpartisan League, the CP, and the CLP, and the general climate of repression that prevailed throughout the 20s made it extremely difficult for rebuilding to occur. With regard to the CP in particular, both party and FBI sources concur that this meant a drastic decline in membership over a span of barely more than 6 months. In October 1919, the CP ranks totaled 27,341, while by April of 1920, they had shrunk to 8,223. Hence, when Hoover was able to recast the GID as the FBI in 1924, he was very much in a position to sanctimoniously disavow any further quote-unquote political activities on the part of his bureau, not because of any legal or moral considerations, but because he could feel he'd already destroyed radicalism as a viable force in American society. Throughout the 1920s and most of the 30s, the director was true to his word, at least insofar as placing a counterintelligence focus upon the CP per se was concerned. Rather, the application of such methods became situational, designed to, quote, keep a lid on party growth by destroying particular projects through which the CP hoped to bolster its shattered credibility. Examples of this include FBI collaboration in the brutal suppression of the party-backed textile workers' strikes in Passaic, New Jersey, 1926, New Bedford, Massachusetts, 1927, and Gastonia, North Carolina, 1928. Similar handling was accorded CP initiatives to support the unemployed movement and bonus army during the 1930s, while pressure was maintained upon those such as Eugene Dennis, Jack Barton, Sam Darcy, and Harry Bridges identified as key party leaders. Communist Party forays into union activities in the 1930s were also repressed quite harshly, and with bureau complicity, as in the Imperial Valley, California agricultural workers' strike, 1930, and the Harlan County, Kentucky coal miners' strike, 1931 to 1932. Still, the decade of the Great Depression provided rather fertile ground for CP recruitment, and by the late 1930s, party membership was estimated to be as high as 40,000. Hoover therefore appears to have determined that a resumption of counterintelligence measures against the party would be in order. In this desire, he was aided to some extent by the formation of Representative Martin Dees' House Un-American Activities Committee in May 1938, and, briefly, by a wave of anti-CP sentiment following the signing of the Nazi-Soviet, quote, Mutual Non-Aggression Pact in August of 1939. Beginning at least as early as September 6, 1939, Hoover utilized a directive from President Franklin D. Roosevelt as the authorizing basis for illegal action against the party. The relevant portion of Roosevelt's instruction reads as follows. The Attorney General has been requested by me to instruct the Federal Bureau of the Department of Justice to take charge of the investigative work in matters relating to espionage, sabotage, and violations of the neutrality regulations. This task must be conducted in a comprehensive and effective manner on a national basis. To this end, I request all police officers, sheriffs, and other law enforcement officers in the United States promptly to turn over to the nearest representative of the FBI any information obtained by them relating to espionage, sabotage, subversive activities, and violations of the neutrality laws. Using the term subversive activities as a virtual synonym for the holding of any left-leaning ideological outlook, arch-reactionary Hoover began to devote an increasing proportion of the Bureau's energy and resources to quote-unquote consideration of organizations such as the CP and Social Workers Party, SWP. He encountered no resistance from the Roosevelt administration in such activities, and as COINTELPRO architect William C. Sullivan would later recall, the methods of investigation included such anti-CP counterintelligence measures as sending out anonymous letters and phone calls in 1941. Sullivan also recounted how one of his first assignments as an agent in December 1941 was to bug and monitor party meetings in Milwaukee. But by late 1942, the situation had changed appreciably. With the U.S. engaged in World War II and the Soviet Union a crucial ally in the campaign against Nazi Germany, Roosevelt sought to clarify his earlier position. On January 3, 1943, he issued another statement. On September 6, 1939, I issued a directive providing that the FBI should take charge of investigative work in matters relating to espionage, sabotage, and violations of the neutrality regulations, pointing out that the investigations must be carried out in a comprehensive manner on a national basis and all information sifted and correlated in order to avoid confusion and irresponsibility. I am again calling the attention of all law enforcement officials to the request that they report all such information promptly to the nearest field representative of the FBI. Despite the President's careful avoidance of using the words subversive activities, a matter which can be construed as removing whatever authorization Hoover might previously have enjoyed in terms of placing a bureau emphasis upon operations targeting communist and communist sympathizers, the director consistently cited this 1943 directive as, quote, further authorization for his war on Bolshevism. The FBI's anti-communist activities were thus continued without disruption. For instance, on February 27, 1946, Intelligence Division Head D.M. Ladd suggested in a memo to Hoover that the Bureau undertake a campaign to influence public opinion by leaking, quote, educational material about the CP through available channels. The purpose of this, according to Ladd, was hardly investigative or designed to stop criminal activity, either real or perceived. Rather, it was expressly to cause the political undermining of party support accruing from such liberal elements as churches and labor unions, and to demonstrate the basically Russian nature of the Communist Party in this country. Hoover approved, and Ladd turned to conservative columnists such as Walter Winchell, as well as outright fascist sympathizers like Father John Cronin, to carry the word. Finally, in 1948, the Bureau's role as a bastion of anti-communism and as the primary vehicle for covert action against the CP was concretized and to some extent legitimated. Attorney General Tom Clark formulated a Justice Department policy position shortly after, released as a public statement by President Harry Truman, which relied almost entirely upon J. Edgar Hoover's interpretation of Roosevelt's earlier posture. On September 6, 1939, and again on January 8, 1943, a presidential directive was issued providing that the FBI should take charge of investigative work relating to espionage, sabotage, subversive activities, and in related matters. The FBI has fully carried out its responsibilities with respect to the internal security of the United States under these directives. I wish to emphasize at this time that these directives continue in full force and effect. Investigations in matters relating to the internal security of the United States must be conducted in a comprehensive manner on a national basis and by a single central agency. The FBI is the agency designated for this purpose. At this time again, I request that all information concerning activities within the United States, its territories or possessions, believed to be subversive in nature, be reported promptly to the nearest field representative of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. After a lengthy review and consultation with his National Security Council, Truman issued a revised version of this statement, broadening his authorization of Bureau action against subversives and in related matters on July 24, 1950. Meanwhile, during HUAC hearings in 1949 and 1950, the FBI resumed its open collaboration with the now democratically controlled committee. In fact, the major purpose of HUAC hearings during these years seemed to be that of publicizing information in FBI files, as the matter has been put elsewhere. The FBI's efforts to contain radicalism by such techniques as leaking derogatory information about prominent radicals and organizations did not constitute the sole political activities of FBI officials. They also sought to reduce the ability of radical organizations to function effectively or recruit new members. For a time, with the intensification of Cold War fears and the rise of McCarthyite politics, these informal efforts bore fruit. In 1948, for example, 12 Communist Party leaders were indicted under the Smith Act of 1940, 18 USCA 2385. Then, under provisions of the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1950, 66 Stat 163, and the Communist Control Act of 1954, 68 Stat 1146, Communist Front, and Communist Action organizations were required to register as foreign agents with the Subversive Activities Control Board and to label their publications as communist propaganda. Beginning in 1947 and extending throughout the 1950s, moreover, through highly publicized hearings, congressional committees, notably the House Committee on Un-American Activities and the Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security, relied directly or indirectly on FBI investigative reports to expose communist influence in the federal government, in the entertainment industry, in labor unions, and in public schools and universities. Last, FBI investigative reports were employed during the conduct of federal loyalty security programs to raise doubts about the loyalty of and deny employment to certain quote-unquote subversive individuals. As a result of such harassment, J. Edgar Hoover was able to announce that the anti-communist crusade in which his bureau was playing such a leading role had been able to bring about a reduction in overall CP membership to approximately 12,000. Apparently realizing that his boast might be construed as an admission that there was no longer a need for the Bureau's services in combating subversion, he quickly offered a warning that although the number of party members might no longer be large, the public should not allow the information to be used by the ignorant and apologists and appeasers of communism in our country as minimizing the danger of these subversives in our midst. The 1953 change from Truman's liberal Democratic administration to that of conservative Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower entailed no discernible alteration in the government's view of the FBI's self-defined mission of fighting communism. To the contrary, on December 15, 1953, Eisenhower issued a statement in this regard which amounted to little more than a paraphrase of that offered by Truman in 1950. Under Eisenhower, the bulk of FBI anti-CP activity was carried out under the heading Cominfil for communist infiltration. With this program, the Bureau supposedly investigated party attempts to influence blacks, young people, women, veterans, religion, education, industry, and other targets. But as the Senate Intelligence Committee reported in 1976, although the Cominfil investigations were supposed to focus only on the CP in its alleged role as an agency of a foreign power, attempts to infiltrate various groups, in practice the target often became the domestic groups themselves. and the infill investigations reached into domestic groups in virtually every area of American political life. There is no evidence that anyone in the Eisenhower administration ever expressed concern over the situation. Cumulatively, all of these things laid a reasonably solid post hoc policy foundation under the Bureau's anti-CP counterintelligence efforts, which dated from the early 1940s. A flow of activity which congealed into COINTELPRO CP USA by the 1950s. That the new program was devoted entirely to extralegal or clearly illegal rather than prosecutorial initiatives was both because what the FBI had typically found objectionable about the party was its politics rather than any defined or definable criminal behavior, and even when this was not the case. High-level FBI officials had always been deeply concerned about prosecuting activities. These concerns increased after 1947 as FBI officials became troubled by the effect of prosecution on the FBI's intelligence gathering capabilities. For example, over 100 FBI informants had to be exposed during the various Smith Act trials and Subversive Activities Control Board proceedings. Then, in a series of important rulings in 1956 and 1957, the U.S. Supreme Court imposed major restrictions on uses of FBI reports, challenged the premise that individual liberties must be sacrificed to safeguard the national security, and thereby threatened to close what for the FBI had been an effective means of propagandizing anti-radical fears. In any event, Hoover provided a briefing report on the progress of COINTELPRO CP USA on May 8, 1958. Although much has subsequently been made of the notion that the Bureau's COINTELPROs were conducted on an entirely autonomous basis and without the knowledge of higher-ups, Hoover's missive to Attorney General William Rogers and Special Assistant to the President Robert Cutler spelled out quite plainly that for nearly 2 years the FBI had been engaged in an extensive program, quote, designed to promote disruption within the ranks of the Communist Party. Specifically mentioned were tactics of using infiltrators to spark acrimonious debates and increase factionalism within the CP, and a campaign of anonymous mailings to generate disillusionment with and defection from the party. This was followed 6 months later, on November 8th, by Hoover's provision of a personal briefing to Eisenhower's full cabinet concerning his anti-CP operations. Although the director's exposition could hardly be described as exhaustive, he utilized a classified or top secret 36-page booklet which described COINTELPRO CP USA as follows. To counteract a resurgence of Communist Party influence in the United States, we have a program designed to intensify confusion and dissatisfaction among its members. During the past few years, the program has been most effective. Selective informants were briefed and trained to raise controversial issues within the party. In the process, they may be able to advance themselves to high positions. The Internal Revenue Service was furnished the names and addresses of party functionaries. Based on this information, investigations have been instituted in 262 possible income tax evasion cases. Anti-communist literature and simulated party documents were mailed anonymously to carefully chosen members. As Robert Justin Goldstein has observed, although the precise results of FBI efforts cannot be determined, between 1957 and 1959, what was left of the CP was virtually destroyed by factional infighting. Even as the CP collapsed into a tiny sect of a few thousand members, FBI COINTELPRO activities increased and expanded. When the political winds blew liberal Democrats back into the executive, replacing Eisenhower's Republicans in 1961, the COINTELPRO status quo was maintained. On January 10, 1961, Hoover apprised the incoming Kennedy administration of the anti-CP COINTELPRO by sending identical letters to Secretary of State designate Dean Rusk and Attorney General designate Robert Kennedy. These read in part that some of the Bureau's quote-unquote more effective anti-communist counterintelligence operations included penetration of the party at all levels with security informants, use of various techniques to keep the party off balance and disillusion individual communists concerning communist ideology, investigation of every known member of the CPUSA in order to determine whether he should be detained in the event of a national emergency. As an adjunct to our regular investigative operations, we carry on a carefully planned program of counterattack against the CPUSA. In certain instances, we have been successful in preventing communists from seizing control of legitimate organizations and have discredited others. Neither Rusk nor Robert Kennedy, nor John F. Kennedy for that matter, appear to have asked any questions on this matter or suggested that perhaps the Bureau was exceeding its investigative mandate in launching intentionally disruptive direct action operations against a domestic political formation. The same may be said for President Lyndon B. Johnson. Under his administration, subsequently admitted COINTELPRO operations numbered 230 in 1964, 220 in 1965, 240 in 1966, 180 in 1967, and 123 in 1968. As concerns the CP, COINTELPRO activities against the CP continued, with such tactics as informing the news media that the son of a CP couple had been arrested for drugs and that the wife of a CP leader had purchased a new car as an example of the quote-unquote prosperity of the CP leadership. In 1964, the FBI planted a document in the car of a leading New York CP official that made him appear an informer. Subsequently, the official, who had been convicted under the Smith Act and ordered to register as a communist by the Subversive Activities Control Board, was expelled from the party. A 1965 FBI memo reporting the expulsion stated that the affair, quote, crippled the activities of the New York State Communist Organization and the turmoil within the party continues to this date. The FBI created a fictional organization in 1965 entitled the Committee for Expansion of Socialist Thought in America, which purported to attack the CP from the Marxist right. As a result of other COINTELPRO activity, an FBI internal memo stated in 1965, quote, many meeting places formerly used on a regular basis by the communists have been barred from their use. Frequently, actions which came under the CP COINTELPRO label were directed at non-CP groups and individuals. Thus, the FBI targeted the entire Unitarian Society of Cleveland in 1964 because the minister and some members circulated a petition calling for the abolition of HUAC and because the church gave office space to a group the FBI did not like. In 1965, the FBI tried to block a city council campaign of a lawyer who had defended Smith Act defendants. In 1966, the FBI tried to get the Texas State Alcohol Beverage Control Commission to raid a Democratic Party fundraising affair because two Democratic candidates who would be present had participated in anti-war and anti-HUAC activities. Hence, having received what amounted to concurrence from at least 4 successive presidents that illegal operations against the CP were quote-unquote justified and would therefore be condoned and hushed up, Hoover escalated the level of tactics employed within COINTELPRO CPUSA to include attempts to orchestrate the assassination of quote-unquote key communist leaders. By 1964, this took the form, as is revealed by the accompanying October 4th, 1966 memo from counterintelligence specialist Fred J. Baumgartner to Bureau Assistant Director William C. Sullivan of, quote, Operation Hoodwink. The plan was to provoke a dispute between organized crime and the CP, and as the means by which La Cosa Nostra tended to resolve conflicts was rather well known even to FBI officials, the desired outcome of the scheme is not mysterious. As is readily apparent in the following memo from Hoover and dated October 10, 1966, the concept was quickly approved and implemented. Finally, as is demonstrated by the third document in this series, from the SAC, New York, to Hoover, dated January 22, 1968, Operation Hoodwink was not only continued over a sustained period, but broadened to include a range of entities outside organized crime as well. Although, unlike COINTELPRO's directed against other organizations, see chapters 4, 5, and 7, there is no evidence that any CP member was actually killed as a result of Operation Hoodwink. This is obviously not for lack of the FBI's having tried to make things turn out otherwise. Perhaps ironically, it was Hoover's personal obsession with the CP, undoubtedly developed over more than 4 decades of trying unsuccessfully to destroy it while constructing his personal anti-communist empire, which led him to insist on going ahead with repression of CP USA even after it had accomplished its objectives, and to thereby foster a bitter factionalism not only within the target organization, but within the FBI itself. By the second half of the 1960s, the CP had become so debilitated by the combination of unremitting counterintelligence operations aimed at it. In 1975, the Justice Department admitted the FBI had engaged in 1,388 separate COINTELPRO actions against the CP between 1956 and 1971, and its own ideological contradictions that its membership had sunk from more than 80,000 in 1946 to less than 2,800. Of these, fully half were categorized as inactive, while the remainder averaged 49 years of age and were considered totally ineffectual by the Bureau's own investigators. William C. Sullivan, under whose immediate authority the COINTELPROs fell, therefore sought to reallocate his resources to focus upon, quote, the mainstream of revolutionary action in the U.S., a trend he associated, correctly enough, with the Black and Puerto Rico liberation movements and the New Left. Hoover adamantly refused, and so, as Sullivan recounts, even though the CP USA was finished, we kept after them. Early in 1969, we learned that the Soviet Union planned on sending CP head Gus Hall a gift of some expensive stallions and mares which Hall planned to ship to his brother's farm in Minnesota. They expected to breed thoroughbreds and sell the colts to help fill the coffers of the party. On learning about the impending gift to Hall, one of the imaginative men in my division came up with an idea, which Hoover quickly approved. He contacted a veterinarian, and without telling him what it was about, got the doctor to agree to inject the horses with a substance that would sterilize them before they were taken off the ship in New York. It was not a disagreement over whether endeavors such as COINTELPRO were warranted or should be pursued, but against whom and by what prioritization. Sullivan had come to view such anti-CP activities as, quote-unquote, the horse caper, as being largely childish, nonsensical, or misdirected, eventually informing Hoover that if there's no longer a communist problem, we should not spend money on it. In fact, I have for some years been taking men off communist work in the field and here at headquarters and putting them on some important work. Meanwhile, he had become actively involved in a Nixon administrative planning group headed by Tom Houston, and intended to bring about greater coordination among U.S. intelligence agencies, upgrade the effectiveness of domestic counterintelligence activities, and ultimately to depose, quote-unquote, dinosaurs such as Hoover. This is taken up in more detail in Chapter 6. The director sensed what was going on. Hence, when Sullivan finally went public on October 12, 1970, with his contention that the CP posed no significant threat to national security, Hoover used this insubordination to force the younger man into retirement. A significant portion of the Bureau supported Sullivan, and there is evidence that only Hoover's timely death on May 2nd, 1972, ended a process which was rapidly eroding the carefully crafted FBI cohesion the director had built up over the preceding half century. End of Chapter 2.